So for the last panel, we're going to dispense with the PowerPoints, and we'll have a panel discussion. We're going to switch now to talking about policy specifically. You've heard lots of different references to various different policy mechanisms in the different sectors, and so we have a very astute group to address that topic specifically. Let me just do a quick introduction, maybe in reverse order of the speakers' opening comments. I want to start with Tony Usibelli, who was with us last year in the first Energy Symposium. So Tony, you're kind of the returning champion here, I think. So for that, I'm going to ask you to go last. Tony was born in Usibelli, Alaska, where his family owns the Usibelli coal mine. That was something I learned this week. It's a very interesting tidbit. But he's been with the state of Washington and was the leader of the Washington State Energy Office in Olympia. More recently, he's been with the Department of Commerce and is currently the special assistant to the director of the Department of Commerce and has been, again, one of the founding members of our Energy Advisory Board. I want to thank Tony for his prodigious contributions to that. And then we have Vlad Gutman-Britten, who is the Washington Director of Climate Solutions. And I want you all to know there are also other nonprofit groups doing fine work in clean energy in Washington and the Northwest besides Climate Solutions. However, we're very glad to have Vlad here. Previously, he was with the Washington Wildlife and Recreation Coalition. And then I have Brendan O'Donnell from Seattle City Light, where he is energy planning executive, and prior to that, Brendan was with Rocky Mountain Institute, so I guess that's the other overrepresented nonprofit here between Brendan and myself and Galen, being alumni of RMI. But you know, it's interesting, if you had an energy and transportation conference just a few years ago, you would have talked about the different share of energy resources, oil, and oil, and you probably would have noticed very little importance of electricity, and you probably wouldn't have occurred to you to have a speaker from the electric utility industry. And I think it's been very clear already today how important electrification is and how central a role electric suppliers will play. So we're glad that Brendan's here. And Brendan, I'll turn it over to you to kick off our policy discussion.
All right, thanks. And thanks for adding executive at the end of my title.
What's the right word?
Just analyst, yeah.
Analyst.
So, you know, as I look around the room, it's kind of unfortunate that between you and happy hour is somebody who works at a utility talking about regulation and policy. So I'll try to be brief, and as David Roberts alluded to, this can get boring, so I'll try to be not quite a minute and a half as he suggested, but short enough. So I love hearing about all the incredible applications of electrification. We're very bullish on electrification as an industry. We think it's a tremendous use for our carbon-free electricity, particularly in Seattle. So it's good to see all the technology and potential application. But for us, we really think that it hinges on good charging infrastructure. So there is a gap in the market for high quality, readily available ways to charge up vehicles. Whether it's a personal vehicle, whether it's a workplace charging application, whether it's buses, transit, you know, heavy duty uses, it's all really important, and it requires the infrastructure to get the electricity from us as a utility into the cars and the different vehicles that are being electrified. So I wanted to spend a few minutes explaining how I think the policy can enable the market, both for utilities, because that's where I work, but also more broadly. So utilities are a diverse bunch. I work for a municipal utility. We're regulated by government. We're actually overseen by our city council. So that's one kind of utility, and we have our own set of motivations. There's also investor-owned utilities, which are owned by shareholders and are regulated by commissions. So the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission oversees Puget Sound Energy and other investor-owned utilities in the state. So the reason I bring this up is that despite the diversity in different ways electricity is generated and gets to customers across the country, we move as an industry. The electric utility industry, once we decide to do something, we put resources into it. So because this is the last session of the day, I want to get a little bit of participation here. So, all right, so would anybody like to guess last year how much money was spent by electric utilities on energy efficiency? Whole country, utility industry spent on energy efficiency. 2 billion? I heard 2 billion over here. 7 billion. Less than pet food. It probably is less than pet food, but that, yeah. 7 million is a really, really good guess. It's $8 million was spent last year. I'm sorry, $8 billion, sorry, was spent by utilities on energy efficiency. $8 billion went out the door from electric utilities, which I suppose compared to goods movement, which is 10 trillion, it sounds relatively small. But the fact that the utility industry spends so much money selling less of their product was unfathomable a generation ago. Unfathomable. And so I really think that the success of energy efficiency and using utility dollars to fund infrastructure is a big opportunity, a huge opportunity. And just to put that $8 billion in perspective, when the governor was speaking this morning, I did a little research. And $100 billion is the equivalent of almost 120,000 new Teslas. It's the equivalent of over 60 Washington State ferries. And perhaps most importantly, it's the cost that Donald Trump put on building a wall last year. So the point that I'm making is that we can leverage this investment in transportation, both utilities and otherwise. So hopefully I've made the case that there's a desperate need for infrastructure. So I want to spend the last few minutes giving my thoughts on how policy can be a push, how it can enable both utilities and the rest of the industry to pursue partnerships and get more charging infrastructure out there in the world. How do we do this? So the first way, which I think is important, is both state and federal policy have a big role. They provide the umbrella policy support in terms of tax exemptions, clean fuel standards, research and development funding. The governor touched on this in his talk this morning. These are all things that are very important. Similarly, Jessica Finkoven from Seattle, from the city of Seattle where I work, highlighted how city policy plays a role. I like how she used the term secret weapon, or yes, cities are the secret weapon against climate change. So cities can do a lot of things in terms of setting aggressive targets for vehicle electrification. 30% by 2030 is a very aggressive goal that the city of Seattle has committed to. We can promote shared use mobility, so having more electric vehicles and car shares and ride sharing services is a big thing that can get more electric vehicles out there in the market. And then develop more aggressive codes and standards to encourage private investment for charging in the right-of-way, at community centers, neighborhood hubs. There's a big role for city policy to play. But as Joel alluded to, I work at Electric Utility, and we think that there is an equally large role for utilities to play in this space. But being utilities, we are regulated industries, whether by our city council or an oversight body like a commission in the state of Washington. So what the case that I'm making is there is a huge opportunity for commissions and legislative bodies to define how we best leverage this investment from utilities in terms of infrastructure. So Vlad, I think, is going to touch a little bit on how the UTC is going to do this. But the case that I would make is that in Washington State, we need parity among electric utilities to spend ratepayer dollars. And the way that we do that is by the legislature acting and giving us the authority to spend ratepayer money on charging infrastructure. Right now, the only way City Light or other government-owned, publicly owned utilities in Washington State can put charging infrastructure out there is by owning it. We want to use the same structure that we've used on energy efficiency, which is largely incentives to private customers and private businesses to support charging infrastructure. So give us the authority at the state level to do that. We have a bill in the House currently, 1335, that's seeking that authority, and that is a very direct and applied policy push from the legislative body that encourages utility investment in infrastructure. Do this in Washington State, have commissions across the country do similar action to provide us this authority, this clarity, to leverage utility investment in charging infrastructure. So I feel as this is going on that I'm on a soapbox a little bit, but it's a big opportunity. It's an $8 billion opportunity to leverage investment that utilities have on charging infrastructure. Let's get that clarity. So that's it.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. Vlad, Brandon already introduced you, but we'll turn it over to you now. Thanks.
I'm still Vlad. So thank you for, really appreciate the opportunity to come talk to you folks today. It's really exciting. Climate Solutions, who's been referenced a bunch of times, you said there are other organizations. Climate Solutions has been around for close to 20 years. We do work in Washington and Oregon principally. We're a Northwest-based clean energy organization and have really focused on trying to, our tagline is practical, profitable solutions to global warming, and really trying to focus on ways to catalyze private sector partnership to bring together the private sector with the NGO community, with the equity community, and other kind of advocacy organizations to really plot a path forward that leads to broadly shared prosperity that also happens to face prevent the apocalypse from happening in the next few decades. So. I want to talk about two kind of general topics that we've been really focused on when we consider the transportation sector. One is grid impacts in the path to climate stability, and two is the equity impacts of transportation and the opportunity to deal with them. So when we look at the reductions necessary to achieve climate stability, there are a lot of goals in various states. California has an 80% reduction goal by 2050. Our Department of Ecology made a recommendation that Washington adopt the same goal. In order to achieve even that level, which some say is not ambitious enough, you need to have deep cross-sectoral reductions. The problem is that there are places where we don't have very clear pathways to achieve those reductions. Process emissions from the industrial sector, for example, cement, steel, and things like that. And that means that the energy sector has to go even deeper. A state study that's forthcoming will show about 86% reductions necessary from the energy sector in Washington alone. And like I said, other studies show that we need to get even further down by 2050, potentially fully carbon neutral. And so our big concern is that when we talk about transportation, that we don't do so in silos. If we talk about deep reductions in the transportation sector, we have to make sure that policy and regulation are guided to make those similar reductions in the electric sector. A lot of our utilities, not Seattle City Light, but a lot of utilities in the state of Washington and nationally are eager and growing more and more eager by the day to explore this sector and to really make money from it. But their preferred option for serving that new demand is new natural gas build-out, and that is a really deep risk. If we fully were to electrify our transportation sector in the United States, that would cost the oil and gas industry about $400 billion in annual revenue and generate about $100 billion in new revenue for our utility sector. And so figuring out how we serve that demand is a kind of a core question. How much new generation is required, and what is the fuel from that generation? For that generation. If we serve it by building large new baseload natural gas, if we don't intelligently control and regulate and incentivize smart charging so that people come home and all plug in at peak times at 6 p.m. and we serve that load with inefficient and expensive natural gas peakers, we are losing and we're muting the carbon benefit. We'll go from 19.6 pounds per gallon of gasoline to about, depending on how you count, 3 to 5 pounds per e-gallon of electricity. And that's a reduction, but it's not consistent with a decarbonization pathway that I've articulated before. The other kind of risk there too is that this sort of build out that I'm talking about, it costs money. If we need to substantially expand our transmission, substantially upgrade our distribution system, and make investments in generation, those are all costs that get passed on to rates. And if we pursue deployment in a dumb way and build all those costs into rates, and the financial advantage of electrification compared to using gasoline is also muted, especially as the demand for gasoline and diesel come down, their prices you could expect to become more and more competitive with an electric sector that is not intelligently adapting to new demand from mobile sources. It doesn't have to be this way, and there's a really big role for policy to address this. In the legislature, we have pursued long-range utility planning for aggressive deployment. So we think utilities should consider travel and commute patterns and how that could impact charging. We want utilities to work backwards from a goal of ambitious electrification instead of forwards, just forwards the way they do now in response to new demand from their customers, and see what the opportunities and what ideal ways to serve that load is, and pursue proactive measures to accelerate that deployment. And we want to work at the regulatory level to incentivize rate design that encourages off-peak charging, and that supports a variety of other kind of techniques that will reduce the impact of the electricity grid from this kind of rapid electrification. We should also encourage our utilities to, we've talked about this a little bit, but think about those onboard storage assets as grid assets. Vehicle-to-grid integration, demand response, off-peak charging, as I mentioned, but the second life use of those batteries for grid management purposes, really bringing fleet owners and utilities together to share the currently high cost of acquiring batteries, has the potential to make a more resilient grid, put downward pressure on rates instead of upward pressure on rates, and accelerate deployment and much faster than if we think about this in silos. What else should I talk about?
You can save it for questions.
I did want to, so I'll skip a little bit here, but I wanted to talk about some of the equity impacts that have come up a little bit. You know, for the last several years, Climate Solutions has really started thinking about this more and more. What is the equity impacts of the policies that we pursue? What is the equity impacts of the fossil fuel economy, and how do we mitigate those? One of the most alarming facts, I think, that I kind of come back to is the Duwamish Valley, which is the kind of the industrial corridor of Seattle. It's parts of the city around the port of Seattle, and again, kind of the industrial places where Nucor and Ash Grove and some companies like that are. If you look at the life expectancy in the communities surrounding that part of the city, it is lower than the countywide average, and it is 13 years lower than it is in suburban King County. And there's a variety of reasons that is, but among the kind of chief reason is that folks come home, they go to sleep, they breathe in benzene, which is linked to leukemia and a variety of lung diseases. They breathe in diesel particulates, they breathe in NOx, all byproducts of fossil fuel combustion. And so we've spent a lot of time trying to think about how do we prioritize the work we do on climate to front load benefits to vulnerable communities. And so, you know, we've in the past advocated successfully for single occupancy vehicle credits and incentives, but this year we really kind of shifted our focus to heavier duty vehicles. Just last week, the state Senate passed a bill that we worked on with Association of Washington Business, that will provide up to $100,000 incentive per electric truck or bus that is adopted by the private sector. And the intent there, you know, I don't think Rich mentioned this, but an electric bus is the equivalent to taking 22 cars off the road. And a lot of those emissions are very concentrated in key areas, so really addressing heavy duty electrification has much more aggressive and faster equity impacts for communities that live adjacent to highways and roadways. We're working on a proviso in the state legislature to direct Washington's share of Volkswagen mitigation funds to parts of the state that are most significantly impacted by NOx pollution, to make sure that we are both serving the climate imperative of electrification, but also concentrating the benefits of electrification in communities that have been most impacted by the harms, and pursuing other policies that kind of advance the same thing. Rich was talking earlier about the electrification of King County Metro's fleet. The first 3 buses that King County Metro deployed were in the city of Bellevue, a much more affluent part of King County. And that's fine. It was an advantageous route that they could kind of test the usability and workability of the technology on. Over the last year or so, Climate Solutions and many advocates, especially from the communities of color worked closely with the county to mold and shape the future deployments and future plans that the county is going to adopt for electrification of their bus fleet. And these next 70 that the county is already committed to will be based not in Bellevue but in South Base, where they will focus, where the routes that they serve are again in South Seattle and South King County and some of the worst air pollution hotspots that the county serves. And so really thinking about ways to kind of match up those priorities, there's big opportunities, and we can make people's lives better, longer, and healthier. Thanks.
Thanks, Vlad. Tony.
Well, first of all, thank you, Joel, for inviting me back again, although maybe you invited me back and put me in the last position here. So I don't know that I can say anything insightful or profound because Ross has done such a good job of organizing the speakers before me, but maybe talk just a little bit about the perspective from the state. And I think you've heard a lot of this, but maybe just a few other areas that are worth highlighting as additional areas where state governments and local governments can have a significant influence from a policy perspective in moving forward for a new vision for transportation. And I think, the theme that you've heard throughout today is that the role of state and local governments in that space is, if anything, much more important than it was even a year ago when we were here. And we need to redouble our efforts, or maybe triple or quadruple our efforts in that area. So I was kind of reflecting back on a lot of what was covered here earlier today and kind of classify it into kind of 4 major areas. You've heard a lot about leading and the role that government can have in leading, both by setting the example, making sure that we're doing what we're telling everybody else to do, and we're also making these kinds of intelligent decisions. So you heard the examples of the purchase of buses and so forth in the state of Washington, and unfortunately I didn't hear the governor's presentation, so he may have covered this, and I apologize if it's been covered before, but we are leading in terms of the state making purchases of all electric vehicles. We had a purchase of 140 plus new Bolt vehicles, the ones that'll have the 240-mile range. I believe we were the first large public purchase in the United States. I do know that we beat California, which we were very happy about. And we are working on a contract now to extend that. And we're ahead of California in getting that contract together, so other states are coming to us now to say, can we build on that contract? Can we be part of the thousands or tens of thousands of these kinds of light-duty electric vehicles that we can purchase collectively? And the great thing about it is, okay, that's the right thing to do from an environmental perspective, but it's also the right thing to be doing from an economic perspective. Those vehicles are going to, over their life cycle, save the state perhaps $3,000 to $4,000 above what we have was one of the first major Prius and hybrid vehicle fleets in the United States. And we're making the right kind of investment decisions. So that's kind of the second piece here, is to think about how the state can support, or local governments can support the development of these activities, and how we make investment decisions. Many of you may know these small examples, but the state also, on a biennial basis, invests on the order of $5 billion in capital assets, in public infrastructure. Now, a lot of that isn't directly transportation type of infrastructure, but a lot of it has implications for transportation infrastructure. And then for transportation infrastructure, it was just a few years ago that the legislature increased our fuel tax and created $16 billion in investment around infrastructure. Well, that $16 billion is going to be a major driver, sorry for the pun, in terms of the nature of what our transportation future is going to look at and look like. And how do we think about that in terms of investments that make sense in the long run, that we're making the commitments today that are going to decide what our energy future is 20, 30, 50, maybe 100 years out, and in particular what our carbon future is going to look like. And so part of that is a significant investment in public-related transportation, and the Department of Transportation really focusing its planning activities around how do we do that in the most sustainable way possible. The other pieces, of course, is that government comes in and tells you what to do. It directs you. And the people, I don't know that anyone has mentioned, the governor may have again mentioned this earlier, but we've established a clean air rule in the state of Washington, the CAR rule, which seems appropriate for the discussion today, that is requiring the largest emitters in the state of Washington, representing about 60% of the greenhouse gases emitted in the state, to reduce their emissions by 5% every 3 years. Now that's small, and should we have done that starting 20 or 30 years ago? Absolutely, but it's a significant step forward, and it applies specifically to natural gas usage, fossil fuel usage, and not only the refineries that you have out here, but the consumption of those fuels. So I think that will be a significant impetus for folks to look at innovative areas where transportation will be a particularly major activity of that. And then finally, Jessica, Vlad, others have mentioned a lot here about the value of collaboration. The Pacific Coast Collaborative. This was founded in 2008. It's a collaboration among the 3 West Coast states, California, Oregon, Washington. Our neighbors up north here, British Columbia. We are actually also talking and engaging with other states around this. The purchasing power, the direction of that group around ways that we can work collectively. We can represent a major economic driver, but also people look to the West Coast states as a policy driver, as a place where we're trying out a whole range of different kinds of transportation strategies and different transportation approaches, whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's land use strategies, whether it is collaboration, most recently about a year ago with a number of the West Coast cities in ways that we deal with port electrification and a number of other kinds of actions that we can take collectively to model, but also to establish policies that we hope have an influence well beyond the borders of the West Coast of North America and throughout the U.S. and I think also throughout the world. So with that, I look forward to your questions and some further discussion in the policy space. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. So I'll kick off the questions, but if anyone has questions, particularly students, you could step to the mic or give me a little signal. But I wanted to return to Tony, and you mentioned the Clean Air Rule, and the governor mentioned that this morning. If that holds up in the courts, which is obviously a process it'll have to go through, doesn't that essentially establish a price on carbon for the state of Washington, given that those targets are somewhat tradable and have flexibility mechanisms built in?
I think it effectively does establish that. I mean, it's called a cap and reduce system. It's not quite a cap and trade system. That has to do with some of the legal authority that the state has and what the governor has to do in that space. But effectively, yes, it does. It says you can go out there and you're a large emitter, and you have a whole range of different ways that you can reduce those emissions. You can take action within your own facility. You can be more efficient. You can change your process, whatever it might be. You can go out and work with a third party and have that third party do projects that might be cheaper in some other type of operation. You might help with electrification of vehicles or something like that, and then prove that out. You might participate in a trading system, or you might do bilateral transactions with others to make those kinds of reductions. And I think, as we've heard earlier, because of the paramount role of transportation, close to 50% of all of our emissions coming from transportation, and the fact that I think there still are a number of highly economic, low-cost kinds of measures, I think we're going to see a lot of that activity likely in the transportation sector, even if you are not an industry or a business that has a lot of direct emissions in that sector. I think so, yes.
Thanks. So I wanted to go back to the question of electrification. This morning, when Eileen was talking about electrification, she really referred to all of those batteries driving around on plug-in vehicles and buses and cars and so forth as a resource for the grid. Vlad, you painted a somewhat more dire picture of potentially increasing grid costs and the need for investment and so forth. It seems to me it all comes down to the question of how well and how able are we to do the job of managing those loads. And so I think each of you probably has a view on where we are and what we need to do to talk about plug-in vehicles as a load that can be managed and that can be a resource as opposed to a burden, and potentially even some analysts have said we could lower customer rates as a result of electrification rather than raise them. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't think we disagree. I mean, we've done quite a bit of analytical work, both from a financial and from a technical impact on our grid of vehicle electrification. And as Joel referred to, we think that at least sort of up to our initial policy goals, sort of 30%, that we have a robust enough system, and we think, at least for City Light, it makes sense with our mix of resources. You know, hydro is sort of a silver spoon. It's very flexible, and it's something that we have a significant capacity in to support this. So, yeah, in the short to medium term, we think we can we think we can serve this load at reasonable cost with reasonable impact. But at scale, the scale that we want, there is going to be quite a bit of thought that needs to be put into how this load is managed. You know, in specific parts of our distribution system at specific times of day, there could be potential for impact. And so there's certainly a value and a need to think deeply and require of utilities to think about how you would manage the charging load. So, yeah, I don't think we disagree on this.
No, not at all. I think my point is if we do it badly, it will be bad. This is what they pay me the medium bucks for. And if we do it well, it'll be the opposite. I mean, I think I wish I had these stats off the top of my head, but I think that there's something like 700 megawatts of storage rolling around on cars in California right now at current levels of penetration. If you look at deeper levels of penetration, that only goes up. You know, and storage is one of the key solutions to energy storage is one of the key solutions to dealing with the decarbonized grid. It's critical for you know, integrating variable renewables and any number of other services that the grid needs to provide. And so if we capture that well for the grid, then the benefits there could be positive. You know, if you look at kind of the traditional daily load chart, it looks like sort of like a camel. It's got two humps and then it kind of trails off, which is not what a camel does. But anyway, and if you shift some of if you don't regulate charging, or if you don't provide incentives for off-peak charging, then your second hump, your peak at 6 p.m. or so is gonna go up, and so you're gonna need to buy energy that is, for the utility, is more expensive to buy. So the utility is losing money on those purchases compared to what they sell the electricity for. And from a carbon perspective, is more than likely more inefficiently produced. It has a higher carbon intensity. On the other hand, if you shift that off into off-peak times, probably at night, but maybe during the day with workplace charging, which is pretty important, then you are more efficiently you're selling more kilowatt hours for the same amount of capital, for the same amount of distribution, the substation capacities that you have, the transmission capacity you have access to, and the generation capacity. And so you've spent the same amount of money, but you're selling more kilowatt hours, so the volumetric rate, the price per kilowatt hour, can come down. Now, at some point, probably with deep electrification, some of this changes and we have to build out more, but fundamentally that's some time away, and in between now and then, it could, if done right, it'll put downward pressure on rates and make us all better off.
So, in theory at least, all those vehicles that are light vehicles, that are cars and light trucks, are parked maybe 23 hours of the day and potentially available. And I always have to laugh because I have this app that I got with my Ford plug-in hybrid vehicle that basically has a function that says value charge, which means when my utility, which originally was Xcel Energy in Colorado and today is Puget Sound Energy here in Washington, says it's less expensive or more desirable to charge, it will wait and charge when the utility says, okay, not now, now. But it's never gotten a call. It's never gotten the signal. So do you think we're gonna like start getting a signal to say, okay, Buster, now's your chance. Now wait until midnight and charge away for pennies on the kilowatt hour? Is that?
Oh, yeah.
Are we close to that?
Oh, no, I mean, the technical...
The car's been ready for 4 years. It's been waiting.
SDG&E does this regularly now. You know,
San Diego Gas and Electric.
San Diego Gas and Electric, sorry. Utility people, the worst. But in the Northwest, the reality is because of our hydro system and the flexibility, the cost of power in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day, the difference between that is pretty small. I mean, it's there. So we certainly could send a price signal. It would just be 2 or 3 cents as opposed to 25 cents a kilowatt hour in California.
So we've got it too easy, is what you're saying.
That's the silver spoon part, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the technical capability is there. For sure.
Okay. In terms of state policy, what do you guys think is needed to advance the electrification agenda? You mentioned the bill that would allow you guys to do more in charging infrastructure. What would you actually invest in?
Oh, that's a good question. So, as Jessica mentioned, what we see as most important are those electrification applications that see the most use, promote mobility, and get different populations who do not have driveways, who have not been early adopters of electric vehicles in those vehicles. So, what we would do with additional authority is likely focus on multifamily applications and also transit. You know, more heavy-duty uses is the biggest opportunity. Those buses get driven a lot. They get driven every day. Personal vehicles get driven once a day for 45 minutes. You know, what's most important to us are charging applications that align with the priorities that Jessica outlined. Heavy-duty, fleets, multifamily, not those with a driveway where they can do 85% of their charging, as Rich alluded to. So those are our priorities.
Vlad, you talked about the buses being, sounds like kind of a sweet spot for addressing some of the inequities of environmental justice. Is that something that's generally true and that we should be prioritizing?
I think buses are a great opportunity because they're the most advanced heavy-duty vehicle in this space. The technology's worked out better in the bus space than it is in other kinds of heavy-duty electrification applications. That's not to say that there aren't other applications. There are, and we should be taking advantage of them. The gentleman from PACCAR had a slide up that referenced electric drayage trucks, for example, which is a massive equity opportunity. Those drayage trucks, they go over a few miles every day, all day. They circle, they idle, and all they do is currently spew diesel particulates. So electrifying those, and in Washington, because of where our two major ports are in Tacoma and Seattle, human beings are breathing that. And so there's definitely other opportunities and intractable problems that we can solve through electrification. Buses happen to be the most advanced technology because it's a public transit bus. It's going through residential areas. It's going from residential areas to where people work. So it's always around people. And so there's a big opportunity there. And because it is run by a non-profit seeking entity, you can get them to do stuff that a private company wouldn't necessarily. The city of Seattle has an environment, has a justice agenda. King County has a justice agenda. Seattle City Light thinks about this too. And that's not to say that all private companies don't, many do, but you can have a conversation with elected officials and talk about, this is consistent with other values and other ways that you need to serve your citizens, and that is much more compelling to them than when you're talking to a private business. And so there's an opportunity to really lead the way through buses. And then, kind of the important thing there is that so much of the name of this game is about building out the supply chains, for being able to produce batteries at scale for buses and trucks and things like that. So when the public sector leads and buys Proterra or BYD or New Flyer electric buses, they're supporting the construction of batteries, which will make it cheaper for the private sector to then do the same thing in their trucks and other applications as well. So, there's spillover effects here that really create an industry where, it's nascent so far, and it's a big opportunity, not just because of the direct impacts, but because it makes everything else much more possible.
And I'd just add, one of the other bus areas is school buses. At one point a few years ago, Washington, I believe, got the lowest rating among states in terms of air quality issues for school buses. And who's suffering those impacts? It's a particularly vulnerable population. It's mostly elementary age school children and so forth. We have about 9,000 school buses in the state of Washington, and we've had a very successful program to retrofit those and put in control strategies. But do we really want to say, let's keep going on those as diesel buses? And we've seen a big reduction, but wouldn't it make more sense to get those down to zero and make those electric buses? Now they have different duty cycles. There are a number of other things about cost and those kinds of things, but I think that's also a particularly significant market that we should be looking at in Washington.
And then in the summer, we could use their batteries for grid purposes.
There you go.
Let's go to the mic. Question?
Jeff Hammerland, a visiting professor here at the Institute for Energy Studies. And first of all, this has been a fascinating conference, and I really learned an awful lot that I really appreciate the tremendous bit of knowledge we've gained here today. I wanted to underscore a point that I think Jessica made briefly, but that I wanted to emphasize, and that is that one piece of the puzzle that could easily get lost, just a tiny piece of the puzzle, but an important piece of the puzzle that still needs to be worked on, is addressing the tremendous set of incentives that are still in our building codes, zoning codes, transportation policies, et cetera, around encouraging single occupancy vehicle travel as opposed to pedestrian, bicycle, and transit-friendly travel. Earlier on in my career, I was a deputy mayor of the city of Beaverton, which is sort of like, well, Portland's biggest suburb, so sort of like Seattle's Bellevue. And we were revisiting our codes and our policies as part of the transportation planning rule, which is an Oregon requirement for all the metro governments in Oregon. And we were amazed to find how many of our policies, most of them crafted in the 50s and 60s, really encourage single occupancy travel and discourage bicycle, pedestrian, and transit friendly. Things like where bicycles were parked, or making sure that the buses didn't get too close to large shopping areas and just have that designed around the big parking lot next to the big box stores. All kinds of things like that. And when we revisited all of those, we were required actually to revisit those and make changes. And that has encouraged, it's still so much more to do, but it has encouraged much more bicycle, pedestrian, and transit-friendly policies, which of course has to be a piece of the puzzle. So I wanted to see if you had any, Tony, you kind of touched on this a little bit too, any thoughts about this?
Well, Jeff, I think you're exactly right. I think that is a very significant area. So in this state of Washington, we have the Growth Management Act, which was in large part intended to help control aspects of urban sprawl and so forth. And that has had certainly some impact, but continues to be highly controversial, and I don't think has been able to achieve all of the original goals that it was intended to. And I think there are opportunities to improve in that space. Building codes, simple things like the state building code that was passed a couple of years ago that now has requirements related to enabling electric vehicle infrastructure. Saying, oh, okay, let's design it right in the first place, and all you have to do is have the capability there. But that saves thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars for decisions that you make a few years later. That it's available. Yeah.
Sam, our colleague from BTC.
My name is Sam Chang. I'm from Bellingham Technical College. I'll be teaching policy and politics next quarter. I have a question at the panel because the last couple of sessions, I learned that we encourage us to buy the EV vehicle and so on and so forth. However, there's a policy I'd like to hear from you is if more and more people buying EV and less people buying gasoline, and then the taxes of the gasoline revenue will drop. So will be the policy makers in Washington State find a loophole to increase the utilities taxes to discourage people buying EV car.
So Washington does have an EV assessment, 100 or 150? I can't remember. It's 150 now per electric vehicle, and that was in part because of a perceived reduction in gas taxes. Of course, we only have 20,000+ vehicles here, so it's been pretty minor. Now, they have directed some of those funds as part of the funding to help develop electric vehicle infrastructure. But I think there are some policy options in that space. For example, Oregon and now the state of Washington is looking at mileage-based approaches that aren't tied to the sales of petroleum as the revenue source. It is certainly an issue, and it really began not with electric vehicles, but with hybrids, with the CAFE standards that folks spoke to before, where you have seen declines in, or at least stabilization of the sales of fuels, and that's why Washington, has, in order to deal with the transportation infrastructure, has had to regularly increase its gas tax.
It's an important carbon tool too. As you mentioned the CAFE standards and things like that. As fuel use and VMT decouple, we need to make sure that we're providing some of that same sort of price signal to move away from single occupancy vehicle dependence and things like that. And so people from the environmental space, we have talked about VMT and congestion charges. People, I think that was mentioned earlier too, as partly ways to retain that incentive and to maybe preserve some money for the state as well.
Thank you.
Last question.
Hello, my name is Andrea, and I'm a geology student here at Western Washington. One energy source that I didn't really hear discussed that much, obviously I'm bringing this up, but geothermal energy. And so I'm curious what policy changes you all think are necessary for geothermal to be viable, considering the really expensive upfront costs, and whether geothermal energy is discussed very often in the energy policy realm.
So there was a bill, I believe, and Vlad, I'm not sure, I believe that bill actually has passed. I think it did. I think it's
the permitting bill?
Yes, so there was a permitting bill in the state of Washington. It's our Department of Natural Resources that is our major geological organization, and they had a bill to streamline some of the permitting. And that was, I think, passed. I don't know if it was unanimous out of the House and the Senate, but it was something close to that. So there have been, some of those small aspects, and there has been some work in the state of Washington, and I think geothermal is a resource that's worth some consideration. You see more of that south of here, California in particular. Nevada is doing quite a bit of development in that space, and I think that there are some attractive aspects to geothermal in terms of what's called a baseload resource, a resource that's available on a continuous basis. I don't know that there are other major policy incentives at the moment. There have been some tax incentives, but because there really hasn't been significant development of geothermal, at least for electricity generation, there hasn't been much uptake of those incentives.
I think part of the reason you don't see a lot of as much interest in it from the policy and advocacy perspective in Washington is because our electric grid doesn't require it as much as it would be useful in a place that doesn't have 70% hydro, that doesn't have CGET, the nuclear plant, and things like that. So for us, the need for baseload renewables is less important than it would be for other parts of the country as they move toward full decarbonization of the electricity sector. It is potentially a really important part of a fully decarbonized grid, though, and we have resources here. We have volcanoes, so.
Thanks. I want to thank the panel and really thank all the speakers and thank all of you, especially the hardcore here that's here all the way till the end. All you guys, again, thanks again.